Today from the global lane, the death toll rises as Nicaraguans demand their abusive president step aside. Supreme Court Justice Kennedy is retiring. We'll look at one recent case where his vote made a big difference. Closed congressional testimony and the lack of transparency at the Department of Justice. A congresswoman calls for harassment of Trump administration officials. Is America heading toward violent incivility? And California forcing pro-life centers to advertise abortion. How about a Chevy truck? And it's all right here, right now from the global lane. Up front, where in the world Nicaragua? After more than 2 months, there are few signs unrest in the Central American country is subsiding. In an exclusive interview with CBN News, the Nicaraguan president's stepdaughter says the world is finally seeing the true nature of Daniel Ortega. And a growing number of Nicaraguans are now demanding that he step down. This is a scene all too common in Nicaragua. Another funeral for a victim of recent political violence. More than 200 people have died in the past 2 months. And now the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights says the government has violated human rights. The UN Commissioner on Human Rights says most of the deaths have come at the hands of police forces and pro-government groups, including allegedly the use of snipers that have led to the wounding of at least 1,500 people.
The gravity of these developments may well merit an international commission of inquiry.
Protests began when the government made changes to the country's social security system. They soon grew into deadly clashes between pro and anti-government forces. The unrest comes of no surprise to President Daniel Ortega's stepdaughter, Zoila America Ortega Murillo, who now lives in Costa Rica. She suggests Nicaraguans are tired of government corruption, and she says her stepfather is an immoral man. In 1998, Zoila America went public with allegations that Ortega sexually abused her when she was 9 years old.
Everybody was defending Daniel Ortega because of his power. But when I discovered that I really was a child of God and that from him I can start a new life and a new birth. In this moment I understand that God is the perfect father.
And now, 20 years later, she says Nicaraguans and the world may finally believe she was sexually abused by the Sandinista leader.
The Nicaraguan people is starting to a process of awakening to knowing who is Daniel Ortega really, and maybe now they can say, yes, Daniel Ortega is capable of making sexual abuse too, because he's an abuser. At the beginning, abusing a girl, and now abusing a country.
Joining us from Managua to explain how Christians and their churches are responding to this wave of violence is Angela Benitez. She and her husband are pastor of a church, and they've been serving the people of Nicaragua for 25 years. Angela, so what's the latest? Are the protests and killings decreasing now?
Right now, there's an estimate of 285 people that have died through violent repression. And so that makes it, in 68 days, 285 deaths. That's about 4 deaths a day, about 1 person every 6 hours in an average. So it hasn't really stopped yet. They're not in all the cities, but some of the main ones that have shown a lot more resistance to the government taking over. Those are the ones that have received a lot more violence, like Masaya or Jinotepe or Matagalpa or Jinotega, cities like those.
So how is the average Nicaraguan responding?
Well, the initial response was everybody wanted to respond in a peaceful protest. At this point, 68 days later, they're really tired of it. Their upsetness toward the government has increased a lot more. There's a lot of anger, a lot of sense of injustice. Hardship breaks you, and I think that that's what our country is going through.
Angela, and we know that Nicaragua is a Catholic majority country. Are evangelicals and Catholics coming together to help people in need? What are they doing?
They are very very much more trying to come in together. It is a grand majority Catholic, but there's a big, it's considered a Christian nation, so there's a big group of evangelicals as well. I think the evangelicals are taking their position regarding their prayer, their intercession, keeping people in the right perspective, and helping people fill up their hearts with faith, and be careful with fear and resentment getting in their hearts. And the Catholic Church is mainly, they're more of intervene in government opportunities to participate in the dialogue, to be mediators in amongst the people that are protesting, and but they have come together a lot. I think there's an admirement at this point of one with the other, one doing their spiritual part, which is, I think evangelicals are more on the spiritual part of what they're doing, and Catholics are more accepted in the political atmosphere, and so they are doing their part there, which has been neat to see as well.
Okay, finally then, what can our audience do? How can we pray?
It is a spiritual oppression over the country, so praying for the country, praying for the people, praying for Christians to rise up in their authority that they have in Christ. Necessarily, this is going to become a very strong financial crisis because people have been without work. Many people have been without work for over 2 months. And we've seen it around us, what affections it has. There's now food shortage because there's not transportation within the country, or it's very limited. So I know this is a country chosen by God. I know that God will use this country as a example to the nations of how we can rise up. But for now, we're in the brokenness.
Everyone in Washington expected it, but no one knew for certain when it would happen. Now, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy has made it official. He's retiring. This means Donald Trump will get the second Supreme Court appointment of his presidency. And a huge political battle over the future of the court lies ahead. A landmark case just decided by the Supreme Court is an example of how the vote of one justice can make a big difference on the home front. In a major win for the Trump administration, the United States Supreme Court ruled that it's within the president's power to restrict travel for citizens of countries deemed dangerous to America. The 5-4 decision angered some on the court. And joining us with some insights is Jordan Sekulow of the American Center for Law and Justice. Jordan, the majority opinion was written by Chief Justice Roberts. What did he say?
Well, and the Chief Justice writing this opinion does not go without mention, because this goes to the heart of presidential power, one of the top issues the Supreme Court grapples with ultimately, and it's why throughout this whole process with the travel ban, or whatever you want to call this this executive order, that everyone knew it would ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court because it had to do with presidential power. And what the Chief Justice said, which is what courts have said when they look back at time, you look at is a president operating under the power both of the Constitution and power that's been delegated to the president by Congress. And here you've got the commander-in-chief power that's in the Constitution in Article 2, and you have a specific statutory power that has been given to the president through the Immigration and Nationality Act, and it's a section 1182F, and it says that a president can determine to stop any class of aliens or non-aliens from entering the country if he believes they will be detrimental for any amount of time. So Congress couldn't have made it any clearer that the president can do this. And again, it's unfortunately, I would say, it was a 5-4 decision when in fact it should have been 9-0. You see the politics at play here.
And I know Justice Sotomayor wrote the minority response, and in a rare move, she actually delivered it from the bench. What did she say?
Again, they have tried to use this idea that this was all about rhetoric and that the president was really trying to implement a Muslim ban. Now, if you look at what was actually put in place here, yes, when you're talking about the threat of national security, many countries are predominantly Muslim, where that threat is from, but they weren't just because they were Muslim countries. I mean, when we started out, there were 8 or 9 countries, and the list has gotten smaller. Countries that are not majority Muslim, like North Korea, have been added as well, and 2 majority Muslim countries have been taken off. Iraq and Sudan were able to comply. That's the cool thing about this travel order, is that if you comply with what the U.S. wants and you can work with the U.S., you can be taken off the list regardless of what the religious majority makeup is of your country.
Well, I know some Muslims have always said the travel policy discriminates against them. It's a Muslim ban. But if you look at the 5 countries, that's only 5 out of maybe 50 Muslim countries.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if you wanted to do a Muslim ban, you'd have to ban a lot more countries, right? I mean, so if you look at this list, and Gary, you travel around the world a lot, and I've done a lot of travel as well. Initially, many of these countries were places that you could almost consider failed states. I mean, Yemen is still on the list. That's one where, like it or not, there's no way they can comply right now with being able to vet who is getting on a plane or who is traveling from Yemen, and if they are safe or not when they're engaged in the civil war conflict. Same goes for Syria. In Syria, we know that ISIS was able, for a period of time, to actually capture Syrian passport machines to make valid passports. Fraudulent, but valid.
Yeah, I've had people say to me, well, how come Saudi Arabia isn't on this list? After all, they housed that was the home of the 9/11 terrorists. And I said, well, yeah, that was 17 years ago.
Yeah.
The world has changed. The threat has changed in 17 years. Libya, for example, Sudan. And as you mentioned, Syria and Yemen, those wars weren't going on 17 years ago. So how is all of this going to affect U.S. immigration policy in the days ahead, Jordan?
Well, I think this gives the president and the Trump administration a lot more flexibility to decide. As the president said, this was not the be-all, end-all of his national security plan. It got so much attention, Gary, but the truth is this was just one piece of our national security. So I think it's a very powerful tool that this president and future presidents will be able to utilize.
Yet a federal judge in San Diego, Jordan, ordered that within 30 days, the Trump administration must reunite all illegal immigrant children with their parents. And it seems a little like judicial overreach to me, one judge legislating from the bench. What do you think about that?
I think we've already seen the idea from the Trump administration and from officials on both sides that they want to see the family reunifications done, and they have put in the policy to stop families being divided. So this ruling may just be more politics, like you said, and overreach, because ultimately I think this administration would like to see this done well beyond within 30 days. So I imagine this one ends up being moot. If they decide to appeal, it would be because they feel like the judge, again, did not have the authority to make a decision like this. But ultimately, I think we all agree. We want these families to be reunited, even if ultimately they will be, most of them, deported, that they should be deported as family units.
Jordan, what is the authority of these judges? I mean, it seems like a lot of them are legislating from the bench. You get one guy making a decision that affects the entire country.
Well, and that is the travel ban case in a nutshell. Came out of Hawaii and California and a few district courts, and then of course both of those were in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very liberal circuit. So the circuit judges were agreeing with them and using the same kind of rhetoric and not really looking at the law. And there's a big difference. I think, Gary, you saw it with the travel case. You saw Chief Justice Roberts, he looks at the text of the law and the case, and you saw Justice Sotomayor, and she was looking at kind of the surrounding theatrics of the law and the rhetoric that was used around the law and the campaign, what was going on in the campaign around the law. That is fundamentally the two different schools of thought when it comes to judicial philosophy. That activist judge who says, I must get involved, even if there's not really a legal way for me to do so, I'll figure one out. And then a real purist who says, I will look at the law and determine if this violates the Constitution or meets constitutional standards. And that's my job, to call balls and strikes.
Thanks for weighing in. Thanks for your time. Thanks for those insights.
Thank you, Gary.
Just days after the Inspector General testified about his report, more revealing congressional testimony was expected from the FBI investigator accused of bias against Donald Trump. His name is Peter Strzok. But you didn't hear all the juicy details because he testified behind closed doors. Joining us is political strategist, president of the Tripp Scott law firm, Ed Pizzuoli. So what do you think of the private, non-public testimony for Peter Strzok before the House Intelligence Committee?
I don't like it because ultimately the truth is a victim here, because at the end of the day, no matter what, the public should be able to get a snapshot of who Peter Strzok is from their own vantage point. They should see him testify, how he responds to questions. And there are many questions to ask of the person who was the chief FBI counterespionage section head and the number 2 in the FBI's counterintelligence division. He's got a lot to answer for, and I personally would like to see that testimony be made public, so there isn't a volley for the truth after he's finished, a Republican version and a Democratic version. Americans deserve to get a snapshot of this person and decide for themselves.
Americans have always demanded transparency. Doesn't seem like we're going to get it here, at least not on this initial testimony. Now, the committee is taking on Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein for not turning over requested documents and for evading answering questions. Now, they've even threatened contempt of Congress and impeachment proceedings against him. So what do you think? Why isn't Rosenstein cooperating?
I don't know, and it causes great concern about the protective nature of, what should be a transparent FBI, Department of Justice. And let me tell you why. At the essence and the core of the problem that the Inspector General had with Peter Strzok, as well as the problems that we see in DOJ and in the FBI, is that they have to be perceived to be fair arbiters of the facts and not putting their finger on the scales of justice. And what the perception is that the FBI, like Peter Strzok as an example, has been proven, at least from his texts, that the IG report has shown, is that he put his finger on the scale on behalf of Hillary Clinton to protect her, and on the other side, put his finger on the scale of Donald Trump to at least push the investigation to a special counsel, and that's why we're saddled with the Mueller investigation.
Horowitz mentioned that Peter Strzok wasn't the only FBI official showing bias against Donald Trump. He mentioned several others, especially lawyer number 2, who was involved in the Clinton and Russia investigations. So do you think his name should be revealed? Should he be called before Congress to testify? What should happen there?
Ultimately, we need to have all of those names exposed to the public so that they can be questioned and subject to either congressional oversight or some investigatory matter, so we can get, look, at stake here is the underlying confidence that the American public has in these FBI, DOJ. Imagine this, they have such great power, FBI and DOJ together. With that power needs to come a great sense of responsibility. And with that responsibility, people need to be able to trust their investigatory institutions, that they're honest and fair and impartial. At some point, enough is enough, because let's be honest, if Washington is all about investigating the other side, and not doing what they should be doing, then frankly, we lost our way.
And it seems that we've had this ever since Watergate. Bill Clinton, also with Bush number 2. So it looks like we may be in for a long, hot summer and a hotter fall political season. So what do you think's coming next?
This is kind of sort of like scandal soup. No one's paying attention to it unless and until it really becomes something that impacts their lives. In the end, it's about the economy. It's about protecting us from foreign terrorism. It's about maybe striking, a big deal with North Korea where no one thought that was possible. It's about all of the things that I believe about getting government off of both individuals and businesses back so we can have a roaring economy that we seem to be having. Those are things that are important to you and I sitting around the kitchen table, whether or not, frankly, what's the bigger issue here about the FBI and Peter Strzok and Lisa Page is the bias that appears to be innate that the Inspector General found around the FBI investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails and then the Russian Trump probe that led to these special counsel. Those are bigger issues, not necessarily the details about who gets a leg up on somebody else. but that we need to have trust in our institutions, and the balance of the work in Washington should be what people care about, the economy and being safe and secure in our great country.
Strategist Ed Pozzuoli, thanks so much for your insights today. Peter Fonda tweets hateful comments about the president, his son, and wife. Congresswoman Waters calls for harassment of Trump administration officials. And Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders is forced to leave a Lexington, Virginia restaurant. Is this the new norm in America? Are we entering an era of uncivility? Well, joining us from the Media Research Center is Dan Gainor. He's MRC's Vice President of Business and Culture. Dan, from Hollywood to Washington, what is going on? Have you ever seen it this bad?
Well, I think it's in history. It's been worse, but for context, we need to remember it's not always what you say, it's what you do. The left tried an assassination of Trump during the campaign. Another guy charged the stage when Trump was running for office. Since then, we just passed the one-year anniversary of an attempted assassination of multiple Republican congressmen that sent 2 to a hospital, 1 seriously. And let's not rule out a liberal attacking Senator Rand Paul at his home. We're seeing not just the incidents, but the tenor of things has been ratcheted up to the point that the left doesn't want anyone they disagree with to be able to go to a school without confrontation, a restaurant, a movie, go shopping.
And what is the effect when a member of Congress actually calls for administration officials to be harassed?
Well, I think it basically is giving the imprimatur of legitimacy on what they're doing. It basically says, oh, well, if Congress is okay, somebody in Congress is okay with this, then that's fine.
And I know a lot of people on the left would probably say, well, this is all because of the president with his inflammatory tweets and the way he handles himself. So I don't recall this happening to Obama administration officials, this type of harassment. What would have been their reaction if it had?
Well, I think their reaction would have been extreme. And I think you would have had media people calling for widespread arrests and silencing of speech and people to be banned from social media. This is a dangerous trend where they think anything goes. And yet, if the reverse had happened, they'd be screaming so loud you could hear them across the country.
Well, I know that on the left, they're saying the Tea Partiers harassed Obama people and Democrats several years ago. And again, President Trump with his inflammatory tweets. So how is what is happening now any different than that?
Well, one, they're exaggerating things. I mean, there's been an ongoing sort of street combat we've had since Occupy Wall Street, where the left has tried to confront people and also commit widespread examples of crime, as Occupy Wall Street did, and as Black Lives Matter groups have committed crime, etc. 20 police officers were killed or were injured, in a Black Lives Matter protest up in Minnesota a few years back. So then we had the 5 police officers who were killed by a Black Lives Matter supporter in Texas. President Trump, the thing that the left is really doing pushback, Trump said mean things and said people should be confronted aggressively at his rallies. And that's the thing. Oh, well, Trump said this. But they forget that the left was actively trying to silence Trump's rallies. They ended up shutting down one of them. And they had professional disruptors going to these events, trying to silence them. To sort of compare that to having a member of Congress calling for people to be harassed, there's just no comparison at all.
Dan, who's financing this? Because it seems like some of these protests and some of these actions are well organized. Who's planning them? Who's financing them?
Well, I wish I knew. I mean, I know some people on our side will say George Soros is tied to it. Part of the problem with that is George Soros funds almost everything on the left. So you could say that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. If you go back to the Women's March, you could definitely say that. In that case, we did the analysis, and 100 of the groups involved in the Women's March had received like $246 million from Soros, his foundation. That doesn't mean that they did it because Soros told them to, but there's a lot of groupthink going on their side. They think that they can get away with this stuff, and then they take action, and we see media outlets either supporting it or not making a big deal about it.
And finally, Dan, what do we need to do then to stop all of this and become more civil in our politics?
Well, I think we're all guilty of it. We saw with the passing of Charles Krauthammer, a giant who had worked for both sides and was very much an honorable civil guy. I think we all learn from that. But then you look at it and you say, you've got people who are calling for harassment, harassing people at their homes, at their businesses. It's hard to be civil in the face of that. So I think it's responsibility of both sides to try to damp down, what's going on here. Because if we don't, then we head to a path that is not a good place, and we'll all suffer for it.
Well, I think we need more of our leaders to speak out against this, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, you see the parade of liberal congressmen coming out and saying, Maxine, you've gone too far and we need to calm down. No, they instead, by not doing that and by the press not pressing them, she's encouraged to do more.
Okay, Dan Gainor, thanks for joining us today, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
In another landmark ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court voted 5-4 and upheld the free speech rights of pro-life pregnancy centers. Centers fought a California law that forced them to inform patients about abortion. The law required them to tell clients abortions are available at little or no cost. The mostly Christian-based centers felt the law forced them to deliver a message against their beliefs. Folks, the court got this one right, because this is really a matter of free speech. No state should be allowed to dictate what anyone says. And in this case, the state of California forced pro-life Christian groups to tell young women coming into their centers that Planned Parenthood could provide them with an abortion. Not only did the law force these pro-life centers to go against their convictions, it forced them to advertise the services of a competitor. And the abortion industry is big business, whether it's selling aborted baby body parts or performing abortions. Planned Parenthood earned more than $77 million in their fiscal year ending in 2015. Also, it received more than $550 million from U.S. taxpayers in government grants and subsidies. Total assets for the company are estimated at close to $2 billion. So why should the government force these centers to advertise a huge corporation? What's next? The government requiring them to advertise specific products? Remember, that was the objection to Obamacare, because it required people to buy a specific product, health insurance. The state of California mandating that these centers promote Planned Parenthood and abortion is a bit like requiring them to advertise General Motors and suggest that people buy a Chevy Silverado truck. See the absurdity of this government overreach? It's a slippery slope. No, folks, in our democratic republic, our government cannot force us what to say or what to believe. And yes, I'm thankful for the First Amendment to our Constitution and the Supreme Court's affirmation of our God-given rights. Aren't you? So let's cherish it, not abuse it. Psalm 141:3 says, "Set a guard over my mouth, Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips." That's good advice. So let's be careful with our speech and be wise and respectful with what we say and do. And that's it from the Global Lane this week. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.